You know, your cheating heart. You've heard it in every bar, every jukebox, every movie about the South that ever needed a shorthand for heartbreak. It might be the most recorded country song in history, and the man who wrote it, the skinny kid from Alabama with the voice that sounded like God crying, he dictated those lyrics in a moving car, on the highway, aimed at the woman who just gutted his life. He didn't even stop to think. The words came out as fast as his new wife could scribble them down. Minutes. The whole song. One wound turned into a melody before the mile marker changed. That man was dead 4 months later. January 1st, 1953. A powder blue Cadillac convertible is crawling through the frozen mountains of West Virginia. Behind the wheel, a 19-year-old college kid who took the driving job for pocket change. In the back seat, slumped under an overcoat, the biggest name in country music. He hasn't spoken in hours. He hasn't moved. The heater is blowing. The radio is off. The only sound is the engine and the tires cracking over ice. The kid pulls into a gas station near Oak Hill. He reaches back. The body is cold. Rigor mortis has already set in. Hank Williams is 29 years old. In his bloodstream, morphine, injected by a real doctor just hours earlier. In his system, chloral hydrate, prescribed by a convicted felon with a fake medical degree he bought for $35. In the seat beside him, an unfinished bottle of whiskey. And somewhere back in Nashville, an ex-wife is sitting alone in a mansion the IRS is about to seize. The woman who once told a judge her husband had spent $50,000 in a single year trying to drink himself into the ground. But here's what nobody tells you about that Cadillac. The man inside it had been fired from the Grand Ole Opry 4 months earlier. His own band had already moved on. They were backing somebody else. His producer had stopped returning his calls. And the woman who built his career from nothing, the one who dragged him to his first real audition, who fought his own mother for control of his future, who sang beside him on records the whole band begged her not to ruin, that woman was done. She'd taken the house. She'd taken the kid. She'd taken half his royalties on one condition, that she never love anyone else again. Her name was Audrey, and the marriage that made Hank Williams immortal had already killed everything else about him. America turned Hank Williams into a saint the second he stopped breathing. They pressed the records, printed the posters, built the museum. They made the songs into scripture and the death into a parable about genius burning too bright. But the real story isn't a hymn. It's a war. A 20-year war between two people who couldn't live together, couldn't survive apart, and couldn't stop destroying the one thing they built. And the casualties weren't just Hank and Audrey. They were children who got erased, fortunes that turned to dust, and a truth that took 4 decades in an Alabama Supreme Court ruling to drag into daylight. Remember the date of that wedding, December 15th, 1944. Write it down. It's going to matter. Because the piece of paper that was supposed to make them husband and wife wasn't worth the ink it was printed on. And neither of them knew it. Not then. Not for years. And by the time it mattered, it was far too late to fix anything. It had broken. Hiram Williams came into the world on September 17th, 1923, in a log cabin near Mount Olive, Butler County, Alabama. His father, Lon, a logger, a farmer, a veteran of the First World War, named him after King Hiram of Tyre, a biblical king's name for a boy born on a dirt floor in a house with no running water. His mother, Lily Skipper Williams, was the kind of woman who could run a boarding house, raise 3 children, and control a man's entire life without ever raising her voice above a whisper. She was fierce. She was tireless. She was relentless. And she would spend the rest of her life fighting every woman Hank ever loved for the right to own his future. The family was poor. Not the poetic kind of poor that looks good in a biography. Actual, grinding, humiliating poor. Lily moved them from town to town across South Alabama, running rooming houses, taking in boarders, scraping through 1 month to survive the next. And then Lon disappeared. Not dead. Not gone. Something worse. He was alive, but unreachable. Around 1930, when Hank was 6 or 7, Lon entered a Veterans Administration hospital in Pensacola. Then they transferred him to another facility in Louisiana. He would stay in the VA system for nearly 8 years. And in that entire stretch of time, 8 years, Hank saw his father exactly once. Once. One visit. A father who existed somewhere in the world, breathing, eating, sleeping in a government bed, but who might as well have been buried. A mother who filled that silence with discipline and control and an iron grip on everything her sons did. That absence didn't just wound Hank Williams. It carved a hole in him that no amount of applause, no #1 record, no woman's arms could ever fill. And every song he wrote for the rest of his short life was, in one way or another, a letter to that empty room. But the silence inside wasn't the only thing tearing at him. There was something physical, something born into his body that nobody understood and nobody treated. Hank came into the world with spina bifida occulta, a defect at the base of his spine that went undiagnosed for his entire life. It meant pain, not the kind that comes and goes, the kind that lives in your bones, that grinds against you when you stand, when you sit, when you try to sleep. Constant, invisible, relentless. The kind of pain that eventually makes a man reach for anything that promises 5 minutes of silence. Before the morphine, before the whiskey, before the pills, there was music. In Georgiana, Alabama, around 1933, a 10-year-old white boy with a broken back and no father started following a Blackstreet musician named Rufus Payne through the dusty roads of town. People called him T-Tot. He played blues guitar on street corners and outside juke joints, not for audiences, but for coins, for survival. And for reasons nobody recorded, he took the boy under his wing. He taught Hank chords. He taught him rhythm. He taught him something no music school in the country could have given him. The way a blues phrase bends a note just enough to make you feel something words can't reach. The ache, the moan, the sound of wanting something you know you'll never have. Years later, Hank told a Montgomery newspaper the plain truth. T-Tot gave him all the music training he ever had. That was it. That was everything. T-Tot died in a charity hospital in 1939. They buried him in an unmarked pauper's grave. No headstone, no ceremony, no record of where the body went. The boy he taught would become the most famous voice in American music. And for decades, nobody even knew T-Tot's real name. It took Hank Williams Jr. and the Grand Ole Opry to finally put a memorial marker on the ground. The teacher got a pauper's grave, the student got a Cadillac, and neither one of them got what they deserved. Summer of 1943, Hank was 20 years old, touring through South Alabama with a traveling medicine show, the kind of gig where you play between pitches for snake oil and hope somebody drops a quarter in your hat. Audrey Mae Shepard was 22, a farm girl from Banks, Pike County, already separated from her first husband, already a mother. Her daughter Lucretia was barely 2 years old. She was tall. She was striking. She had the kind of face that made men in small Alabama towns stop what they were doing and stare. And she walked into Hank's world with the force of a woman who had already decided, quietly, permanently, that whatever life she was leaving behind, she was never going back to it. He proposed on their second date. Stop, read that again. Their second date. This wasn't a courtship. It wasn't roses and letters and Sunday dinners with the family. It was a collision. Two people who recognized something desperate and hungry in each other and grabbed hold before reason could intervene. He saw beauty in someone who believed in him when nobody else with any power did. She saw raw talent and a one-way ticket out of Banks, Alabama. Both of them were exactly right, and both of them were catastrophically wrong. They married on December 15, 1944, standing in front of a justice of the peace named Emma Boyette, not in a church, not in a courthouse, at a filling station near Andalusia, Alabama, a gas station. The most famous marriage in country music began next to a fuel pump, with no flowers, no family, and a piece of paper that, by the letter of Alabama law, meant absolutely nothing. Audrey's divorce from her first husband had been finalized just 10 days earlier, inside a mandatory 60-day waiting period. The ceremony was technically illegitimate. The vows were legally void, and neither one of them knew it. They would build an empire on that foundation, and when the empire collapsed, the cracks ran all the way back to this moment. Two kids at a gas station, making a promise the state of Alabama never recognized. What Audrey did next is the part her enemies have spent 70 years trying to erase. She didn't just marry Hank Williams, she built him. Lily had managed Hank as a regional act, a local boy with a local following. Audrey saw something bigger. She pushed, she schemed, she fought. And she did the one thing that changed everything. She got him an audition with Fred Rose. Fred Rose was the gatekeeper. He ran Acuff Rose, the most powerful publishing house in Nashville. Without Fred Rose, there is no recording contract, there is no MGM, there is no Opry. And without Audrey dragging Hank to that audition, past his own doubt, past his mother's resistance, past every door that had already closed. There is no Fred Rose in Hank Williams' life. Period. Rose signed him. Sterling Records cut his first session on December 11th, 1946. 4 songs in a Nashville studio, including Never Again, which came out in January of 1947. Then MGM picked him up, and Move It On Over became his first real chart hit. The machinery was turning, but the explosion was still coming. June 11th, 1949. The Ryman Auditorium, Nashville. The Grand Ole Opry. Hank Williams walked onto that stage, skinny, nervous, dressed too sharp for a country boy, and sang Lovesick Blues, a song he didn't even write. And the crowd lost its mind. They called him back 6 times, 6 encores. The audience wouldn't stop clapping, wouldn't stop screaming, wouldn't let him leave. Nobody at the Opry had ever seen anything like it. That single had already been selling 50,000 copies in its first 2 weeks. It hit number 1 the week of May 7th and stayed there for 16 straight weeks. Billboard named it the number 1 country record of 1949. After that, the hits came like weather. Cold, Cold Heart, number 1 country, and then Tony Bennett covered it and wrote it to number 1 pop, selling over 1 million copies. Hey, Good Looking, Jambalaya, I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry, released as a B-side, like an afterthought, like it didn't even matter. It's now considered one of the greatest songs ever written in any genre. Between 1947 and 1952, MGM released 27 Hank Williams singles. 5 were million sellers. 11 hit number 1. He was on the radio, on the jukebox, in every honky-tonk and living room in America. He was untouchable. And behind every door he walked through, Audrey had already been there, pushing, arranging, demanding. She sang duets with him on records. She played upright bass in the Drifting Cowboys. She booked the shows. She handled the money. She fought Lily for control of the business. She was everywhere, all the time, and nobody, not the band, not the label, not Hank himself, could figure out how to have one without the other. Subscribe, because what happened inside that marriage when the music stopped and the doors closed is the part nobody got right for half a century. And you're about to hear the version the courtroom finally proved. And about what people got wrong, there's a story the music industry has been repeating about Audrey Williams for 70 years. The punchline everyone knows. The joke that got louder after she couldn't defend herself. The line a bandmate gave. She couldn't carry a tune in a bucket, and the more she practiced, the worse she got. That quote became her entire identity. Audrey the joke. Audrey the talentless wife. Audrey the woman who ruined every recording session she touched. But notice who controls that story. Hank's bandmates, Hank's producers, Hank's biographer, whose account, the one that shaped public opinion for an entire generation, has been openly criticized for inserting personal hostility toward Audrey into what was supposed to be a factual record. Every brutal word about her comes filtered through men who had professional, personal, and financial reasons to diminish her contribution. Was she a great singer? No, nobody's claiming that. But she played bass in the band. She recorded duets that shipped and sold. She managed his career during the years that mattered most. She secured the Fred Rose audition. She was his business partner, her co-strategist, his first and most aggressive champion. And Hank admitted it himself. To a radio host, half joking, half exhausted, he had to let her sing. He had to live with the woman. That's not a punchline. That's a marriage. 2 people locked in a power struggle on every note, in every room, about every dollar and every decision. Reducing Audrey Williams to a bad voice is one of the laziest, cruelest things that country music ever did. And it's the version that stuck, because she wasn't alive to fight it. The drinking had always been there. It started before the fame, before the records, before Audrey. Alcohol was the first thing Hank reached for when the back pain flared and the silence inside got too loud. But by 1948, it had crossed the line from a problem everyone managed into a crisis nobody could contain. Audrey left him once that year and gave him the ultimatum every wife of an alcoholic eventually gives. Her or the bottle. He chose her. It held. For a while. Then came the fall. 1951. A hunting trip in Tennessee. Hank went down hard, and the spina bifida that had ground against his spine since birth roared back with a vengeance. Now the pain wasn't just chronic, but it was blinding. And the morphine wasn't a choice anymore. It was survival. Into that wreckage walked Toby Marshall. His real name was Horace Raphael Marshall. He was a convicted forger who had served time and upon release purchased a diploma, a doctor of science and psychology, from a diploma mill for $35. He invented an alias, Dr. C.W. Lemon, and started prescribing amphetamines, Saconal, chloral hydrate, morphine, all of it to a man whose body was already failing, whose judgment was already gone, whose entire support system had walked away. Because by late 1952, everyone had walked away. Fred Rose stopped working with him. The Drifting Cowboys, Don Helms on steel guitar, Jerry Rivers on fiddle, the whole legendary lineup were backing Ray Price instead. The Grand Ole Opry fired Hank in August of 1952 for habitual drunkenness and missed shows. The biggest stage in country music looked at the biggest star it had ever produced and said, "We can't do this anymore." And Audrey was already gone. She'd ended it on New Year's Eve, 1951, told him to be out of the house by the time she got back. The divorce went through in 1952. She got the Franklin Road mansion. She got custody of their son, Hank Jr., Randall Hank Williams, born May 26, 1949, in Shreveport. And she got half of every royalty dollar Hank Williams would ever earn, living or dead, on one condition, one clause buried in the settlement that nobody talks about. Audrey could never remarry. If she took another husband, the royalties stopped. Half the money, all of the grief, and a legal chain that bound her to a dead man's name for the rest of her life. It's New Year's Eve, 1952. Hank Williams is booked in Charleston, West Virginia for a show that night, and Canton, Ohio for another on New Year's Day. But an ice storm has shut down every airport in the region. No flights, no way out. So he hires Charles Carr, a college kid, barely 19, to drive his powder blue 1952 Cadillac Series 62 convertible through the frozen dark. They leave Montgomery around 1 in the afternoon. The sky is gray. The roads are sheets of black ice. By 7 that evening, they check into the Andrew Johnson Hotel in Knoxville. A doctor, a real one this time, a man named P.H. Cardwell, comes to the room. He gives Hank 2 injections of vitamin B12, each laced with a quarter grain of morphine, 16 milligrams, into a body already swimming in chloral hydrate, into a bloodstream already thick with alcohol. At 11:15, hotel porters carry Hank Williams out of the room and down to the car. He's coughing, he's hiccuping, he can't walk. They fold him into the back seat of the Cadillac, and the kid pulls out of the parking lot into the night. Somewhere around midnight, at an all-night diner near Bristol, Virginia, Carr tries to get Hank to eat something. He declines. Those are the last words anyone ever hears him speak. Not a lyric, not a prayer, not a goodbye to Audrey or his son or anyone. Just no. He didn't want food. And then silence. Hours of it. The Cadillac pushes through the West Virginia mountains in the dark, the heater blowing, the back seat quiet. Carr drives and drives, and at some point, nobody knows exactly when, the most famous voice in American music stops breathing. The kid pulls over near Oak Hill. He reaches back. The skin is cold. The muscles have locked. Hank Williams is dead. The coroner, Ivan Malinin, performed the examination at the Tyree Funeral House. The ruling, insufficiency of the right ventricle of the heart, hemorrhages in the heart and neck, evidence of a bar fight days earlier, deemed unrelated. The real cause, the one the death certificate couldn't quite bring itself to spell out, was everything: alcohol, morphine, chloral hydrate, a broken spine, a broken marriage, a fake doctor with a $35 diploma, and a body that had been begging to stop for years before anyone listened. Everyone remembers how Hank Williams died. The Cadillac, the morphine, the frozen road. It's the most famous death in country music. But almost nobody remembers what happened 5 days later. On January 6, 1953, a baby girl was born. Her mother was Bobby Jett, a woman Hank had been involved with in the months between Audrey leaving and Billie Jean arriving. Hank knew the child was coming. 3 months before he died, he'd signed a custody agreement. He put it in writing. He wanted that baby. And then the Williams family erased her. Hank's mother, Lily, adopted the infant in 1954, renamed her Catherine Yvonne Stone. When Lily died just a year later, the girl became a ward of Alabama, a state ward, shuffled into the system. She was adopted again, renamed again, Kathy Louise Dupree. She grew up in somebody else's house, with somebody else's name, with no idea who her father was. It wasn't until the early 1980s that she found out. She hired an attorney named Keith Atkinson, who would later become her husband, tracked down the original custody contract, and went to war. In 1985, an Alabama court ruled she was Hank Williams' biological daughter. In October of 1987, the Alabama Supreme Court went further. She was entitled to half the estate. The court called what had been done to her fraud and judicial error. Hank Williams Jr. appealed. He took it all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. They refused to hear the case. The ruling stood. A daughter who spent 30 years without her own name, an estate worth millions that tried to pretend she didn't exist, and a legal system that finally, decades too late, said, she counts. She was always his. Her name is Jett Williams. She's alive today. She co-manages the estate alongside the brother who fought to keep her out. The funeral was held on January 4th, 1953, at the Montgomery Municipal Auditorium. It was the largest public gathering in the city's history. Somewhere between 15 and 25,000 people filed past the silver coffin. Roy Acuff stood up and sang, I Saw the Light. Ernest Tubb sang, Beyond the Sunset. Red Foley sang, Peace in the Valley. 2,700 were seated inside the auditorium. The rest stood in the street, in the cold, weeping for a man most of them had never met and would never stop missing. The music machine moved fast. Your Cheatin' Heart, recorded in September of 1952, just months before the end, was released the day Hank died. It went to #1 and stayed there for 6 weeks. Call Liga charted right behind it. MGM's president told Billboard that photo requests jumped from about 5 before Hank's death to over 300 after. They had to slash their release schedule in half just to manage demand. America wanted more Hank Williams. It just didn't want him alive to make it. The honors came, all posthumous. Inaugural class of the Country Music Hall of Fame, 1961. Alongside Jimmie Rodgers and Fred Rose, the Songwriters Hall of Fame in 1970, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1987, and in April of 2010, a Pulitzer Prize special citation honoring his craftsmanship as a songwriter who expressed universal feelings with poignant simplicity. Every trophy, every plaque, every standing ovation delivered to an empty chair. And Audrey became a ghost haunting her own mansion. She paid lawyers, years of lawyers, stacks of bills, for the legal right to call herself Hank Williams' widow. She tried a solo career, Decca Records. It didn't work. She launched a record label, a publishing company, a booking agency. She formed a backing group called the Cold Cold Hearts and mounted touring all-star shows. She tried everything. Nothing held. The world wanted Hank's voice. It never wanted hers. Not on its own, not without him standing beside her. The drinking took hold. There was a suicide attempt. The IRS began circling, and the debt piled higher than the memories. By the mid-70s, the Nashville house on Franklin Road, the trophy from the divorce, the proof that she'd won something, was a monument to ruin. Audrey died on November 4th, 1975. 52 years old, heart failure. The people who knew her said alcoholism, and the IRS was scheduled to repossess the house the next day. She died 12 hours before they knocked. 2 lives, 2 heart failures, same diagnosis, 22 years apart, and neither one of them ever figured out how to stop running from the thing that started at a gas station in Andalusia. Now watch the wedding date pay off, December 15th, 1944, 10 days after Audrey's divorce was finalized. Inside Alabama's mandatory 60-day waiting period, the marriage, the one that defined both their lives, that generated the songs, the lawsuits, the fortune, and the ruin, was never legally valid. And Hank's second marriage, to Billie Jean Jones, in October of '52, that ceremony happened 11 days before her own divorce was final, another technically illegitimate union. A court eventually upheld it, but not until 1971, 18 years after Hank was already in the ground. The man who wrote the most famous songs about love and heartbreak in American history, the man whose voice defined what a broken heart sounds like for an entire civilization, was never, by the strict letter of the law, legally married to either woman he loved. Both unions were real in every way that destroys a person, and invalid in the one way that could have protected anyone. And Audrey, the woman who built his career from a medicine show to the Opry, who fought for his name, who drank herself to death in a house the government was coming to take, she spent the last 22 years of her life defending the title Hank Williams' widow, She paid for it. She bled for it. She died with it. For a marriage that technically never existed. So play the song again. Your Cheatin' Heart. Listen to it now, knowing everything you know. The woman who was in the car when he wrote it, Billie Jean, wife number 2, remembered it this way. They were driving from Nashville toward Shreveport to announce their engagement. Hank looked out the window, said something about Audrey being a cheatin' heart, then stopped, smiled, said, "That'd make a good song. Get out my tablet, baby. You and I are going to write us a song." And he dictated the whole thing as fast as she could scribble it. Minutes, start to finish. One burst of pain turned into the most recorded country song in history, somewhere between mile markers, at highway speed, before the grief had time to cool. Was that a love song or a weapon? Was the marriage that inspired it the greatest partnership in country music or the longest mutual destruction? Did Audrey build Hank Williams, or did she just survive him? Did he love her, or did he need her? And was there ever a difference? Two people met at a medicine show in South Alabama in the summer of 1943. She couldn't sing. He couldn't stop. They made each other famous, and they made each other miserable, and neither one could figure out how to do just one without the other. He got the Cadillac, the morphine, and the legend. She got the house, the debt, and the silence. And 5 days after the Cadillac went cold, a baby girl was born who nobody wanted to count, and she's the one keeping the whole thing alive today. The songs are still playing. The Cadillac sits behind glass in a Montgomery museum. The marriage was never legal, and the only honest record of what really happened isn't a biography or a ballad. It's a court filing in Alabama, stamped 1987, that says a daughter existed, a family lied, and the truth arrived 30 years too late to save anyone. That's not a love story. That's a country song. And like every great country song, it hurts worse the second time you hear it.